It can be easier to set a boundary from anger because it's such a good motivator. And I actually find it's harder to set a boundary when there's no anger because there's almost no momentum behind it. So you really just have to say it. And there's more of a fear, too, I think, relationally of rocking the boat. When things are overall pretty good, it's like, am I crazy to say this when I know it's going to cause chaos? And so that I think is challenging, and it takes this work to be able to do that. And I think those really are the most powerful when it's not from a place of pushing back, when you're in a place of acceptance and maybe in a place of relative harmony. And you're like, you know what? Actually, this is what's true for me right now.
When most people think about boundaries, they imagine saying no, drawing a line, or protecting themselves from others. But what if boundaries are not defensive structures? What if they are a nervous system skill that allows for deeper, more authentic connection, clearer presence, and long-term resilience? This conversation is for anyone who feels exhausted by relational stress, overgiving, shutdown, or conflict avoidance, and wants to understand boundaries through the lens of neuroscience, somatics, and post-traumatic growth. We are diving into the often missed skill of receiving boundaries without collapse or reactivity, and learning to set boundaries not from anger or dysregulation, but from presence, internal alignment, and nervous system clarity.
Aligned boundaries support financial stability, physical and mental health, and richer, more sustainable relationships because they reduce chronic relational stress. That keeps us from moving into burnout patterns, that allows energy, attention, and resources to be directed towards what actually matters. And in the context of post-traumatic growth, what this season is all about, they reflect a nervous system that is no longer organized around survival or appeasement, but around choice and coherence and the capacity to engage with life and with others from a present state rather than a predicted state. Welcome to Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm your co-host, Elisabeth Kristof, founder of BrainBase.com and Neurosomatic Intelligence, and I've worked with hundreds of individuals and practitioners to bring nervous system health and education into personal development, leadership, and sustainable growth.
And I'm your co-host, Jennifer Wallace. I'm a psychedelic integration and preparation guide who supports individuals in embodying the insights of medicine journeys. You can find more of my teaching available on my YouTube channel, Sacred Synapse. Today, we are joined again by Margy Feldhuhn, seven-figure entrepreneur and co-owner of BrainBase. Margy bridges personal development with nervous system health to support sustainable success and embodied leadership. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode in this season on emotional expression and post-traumatic growth. Welcome, Margy. Welcome back to Trauma Rewired.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, so excited to have this conversation with you, Boundary Queen. Tell us why this topic is so important to you and why you think it matters for our listeners.
I think boundaries are something that is very misunderstood, and it's something that I really misunderstood, not just the conceptual idea of what a boundary is, which I misunderstood, but also the way that healthy boundaries feel in your body. And the experiential aspect of boundaries, I think, is really important. And I don't think that I was able to really grasp what they are and how they actually feel until I experienced it in my body. And the Boundary Queen is such a funny nickname for me because there was a time where I was really not good at boundaries. I thought that I was good at setting boundaries because I was great at saying no to things, but it wasn't true boundaries. It was coming from frustration. Often I was saying no to things that probably would have helped me grow as a person, right? Sometimes it was even avoidant or it was coming out of anger. And I really struggled to receive boundaries. And when my stress bucket got really, really full, I lost my dad to suicide. And that experience, all the trauma that came up with that, I had no capacity and my boundaries got even worse. And for me, it was really receiving boundaries that was so hard. And I had so much shame about it because no one wants to be an adult who feels like a kid inside when someone sets a boundary. But it felt like, especially in my close, intimate relationships, that especially at that time when I was in so much pain and so much grief and so much trauma, I just didn't have the capacity to receive boundaries well, and it felt like an attack. It felt like abandonment. It felt like almost cruelty. And that is how my nervous system was responding to them. And I knew it was dysfunctional. I knew it wasn't right, but it was happening on a physiological level, and I couldn't cognitively change it. And I remember when my relationship ended, I found like the best EMDR therapist I could on the internet. And I called one and I said, I really need help with boundaries. I'm really not good with boundaries. And she kind of laughed because I don't think she gets a lot of people who are like that specific of like, I need your help on this. She was like, okay, we can do that. And that was in 2016. So now, exactly a decade later, I'm the boundary queen, and not to say that I'm perfect at boundaries at all or at anything, but I have grown so much in this area. And I'm so excited to share it with people because this is an area where I did not have a growth mindset previously. I had a very fixed mindset. I thought that this is just who I am. This is just how I am. And if you're listening and you feel that way, that's not the case. This is an area where you can totally grow and transform.
Yeah, I thank you for sharing that about your story. And I am really excited to dive into the components of receiving boundaries as well and that embodied experience of that and the attachment patterns that go with that. But before we go deeper into boundaries, I want to ground us in why boundaries are both so challenging and so vital by looking at the relational foundations of nervous system health. Because when we talk about stress, we typically think about fight or flight, cortisol, adrenaline, individual escape. But evolution actually tells us a much more relational story. So if you listen back to the episode that we did with Matt Bush on post-traumatic growth, we talk about this in a lot of depth, but this is really important information for this conversation. So during the Ice Age, survival depended less on outrunning danger and more on groups enduring hardship together, right? You had long winters, food scarcity, illness. All of these were things that the survival of our species really depended on being able to stay connected and together as a herd. It required cooperation and energy conservation and shared regulation. And that is where we can actually see in the research that as a species, we began to evolve to have an oxytocin dominant stress response, not just the HPA axis or fight or flight, but a tend and befriend response that developed as a neurobiological reflexive adaptation. And oxytocin wasn't just for bonding or comfort, it helped us modulate stress physiologically to reduce threat reactivity in the amygdala, synchronize group behavior, and conserve our energy. And so it supported survival at the group level, not just the individual level. And that was, a long time ago. That was 20,000 years ago. Our bodies were actually developing for this as a stress response. Shelley Taylor's tend and befriend research shows that under stress, especially in females, the nervous system tends to prioritize connection, caregiving, and social affiliation rather than fight or flight. And so thinking about all of this and diving into this research was a really big moment for me and understanding at a much deeper level how non-cognitive and reflexive fawn response is. That it's not a choice, it's a pattern in many cases, and it has served us well for survival, both individually and collectively. Bonding is a core stress response as reflexive as fight or flight. So under threat, our brain doesn't just activate adrenaline and cortisol, it also activates oxytocin pathways through the hypothalamus. That calms the amygdala reactivity, it lowers sympathetic arousal, and it influences our heart rate, our vagal tone, our pain perception, and even inflammation. And then behaviorally, that moves us toward proximity, toward contact, toward co-regulation. So bonding is one of the ways our nervous system manages stress. We know that's especially true for the female nervous system. Estrogen increases oxytocin production and receptor sensitivity. And that explains why so many female nervous systems move toward connection under stress. When connection is safe, that's really deeply regulating. But when it's been unsafe or inconsistent, then this becomes overused and that can show up as chronic fawning. And that means this isn't a response that we can shame or just try to stop. We have to support at a physiological level oxytocin in safe ways, gentle co-regulation, somatic self-touch, repatterning social safety, and slowly building pleasure and connection practices in a minimum effective dose. And there's one more important nuance that I wanted to touch on. Oxytocin isn't simply like a love chemical. We often think of it as our feel-good chemical, but research in psychoneuroimmunology, including Susan Carter's work, shows that that is actually highly context dependent. So oxytocin, it doesn't just make us feel good or want to bond, it actually increases social salience. So it makes us more attuned to social cues. And so in safe environments, that is regulating. But in unsafe environments, or if we are patterned to perceive social cues as threatening, that increase in oxytocin can actually heighten our awareness of threat or perceived threat, rejection or perceived rejection, exclusion or perceived exclusion. So it's actually amplifying those. So if social connection has been threatening, then some of these things that we think of, bonding and connection, can actually create a stress response that leads us more into stress response patterns of fawning and appeasement. Okay, so I think that's really important as we're starting to understand the physiology of this, why we have difficulty with boundary setting and why we move into some of these reflexive patterns.
I related so much to what you said in your intro, Margy, because that's what it was like for me. I felt like I had a really well-wired fight response, and so I would have been one of the people that you felt like you were being attacked with by boundaries because I didn't know how to set them from a regulated place. I sure as heck didn't know what they were, and so when you paired almost that survival response into disorganized bonding, disorganized co-regulation and emotional places, right? That was really fearful for me. So when I started setting boundaries or when I tried to set boundaries, it felt more threatening because I felt like I was severing what little attachment I felt like I had. And then with like the isolation of trauma, I felt like, oh, I'm really putting myself out on an island here. So it wasn't until I really started resourcing safety in my nervous system that I could even begin to understand co-regulation, watch the ways that I would fawn or, to set a boundary and really learn how to say no for myself to go into greater connection, not sever the attachment. And, this really aligns with what Luis Cozzolino has described as the survival of the nurtured. In modern human environments, resilience is not driven by being the strongest or the most dominant, but by having experienced, attuned, responsive caregiving that shapes a nervous system capable of regulation, flexibility, and relational navigation. That is why we are really reframing boundaries as connection to self and to others rather than walls that sever relationships. From a nervous system perspective, humans are wired to regulate stress together. Co-regulation is not optional biology. Infants cannot survive without it, and adults continue to rely on it through shared breath, laughter, touch, vocalization, synchronized movement, and communal effort. These experiences stimulate oxytocin pathways that dampen amygdala-driven threat responses, lower physiological stress load, and support nervous system recovery. Connection also distributes vigilance. In safe groups, threat detection is shared rather than carried alone, which reduces hypervigilance, conserves metabolic resources, and allows the system to return to baseline more efficiently. Oxytocin further supports synchronization, aligning breathing rhythms, movement, attention, and even circadian patterns. Boundaries that preserve connection rather than sever it are aligned with these core survival mechanisms. Trauma complicates the system. When attuned connection was inconsistent or unsafe, the nervous system can become hypervigilant in seeking connection, driven by conflict between authenticity and attachment that we discuss on here so often. Or it can swing toward hyperindependence, mistrust, and reactive boundaries designed to prevent further harm. In both cases, social cues are often misread through a threat lens, leading to overgiving, shutdown, or rigid self-protection. In modern life, where stress is endured without consistent social buffering, isolation and fragmented community push systems into cortisol-dominant loops that erode health and resilience over time. That is why working with the nervous system around embodied, aligned boundaries is so important for post-traumatic growth.
A lot of practitioners think bringing in nervous system work means just adding more tools, but really it's about integration. It's about understanding how the brain and the body are already influencing everything that you do and how to work with that practically.
Yes, when you see the nervous system as your foundation, everything else becomes clearer. You stop guessing which tool to use and you start seeing patterns through a new lens.
That's what Matt and I are teaching in our free live workshop on February 11th, how to understand what regulation really means and how to integrate the nervous system into your existing work so that you and your clients can create change that actually lasts.
It's practical, hands-on, and designed for therapists, coaches, somatic practitioners, movement professionals, and body workers who want to lead this next wave of transformation. You can grab your free seat at neurosomatic.com/integrate. Margy, would you please talk to us about boundaries not as a wall, but as a let go? Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yes, this is something that came to me. I think I was like on a walk and I was like, oh, I feel like this is really big because I had improved so much through neurosomatic work and personal development with boundaries. And I was just kind of reflecting on my walk. This is what I do with my life. I was taking a walk and reflecting on this. And I really think that for me, at least, this is very profound because the way that a boundary feels inside is important. I think what it looks like externally, you could say similar words, but if they're coming from a different place inside, they're going to have a different level of effectiveness. And for me, I realized that boundaries have a reputation of being these like hard lines of like, no, this is you, this is me, this is what I'm okay with, this is not what I'm okay with. And sometimes we can take it so far that we are not able to be connected in community because we won't be inconvenienced at all by anyone else's needs, but then we're not really being part of a community. So we need to find this nuanced balance of not avoiding connection or helping others when we're able to, and not avoiding things that would help us grow, not saying no to something because I'm scared, but it would actually be great for me, and then saying, I'm just so good at boundaries, right? I think self care is so important, and anything can be taken too far to a place where it's not what was intended. And so, what I realize is boundaries, even the word boundary, I don't like, but it's really speaking your truth and letting go of the outcome. If I am speaking my truth from a place of trying to control people or events, that's not it, right? It's speaking my truth and realizing that I can't control what happens after I say that. I can't control how people are going to respond. I can't control the chain of events that it's going to set off. But if I've done the work to not only be able to see the truth inside of me, but then to be able to speak it and release what's going to happen, so often it's magical what unfolds after that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
I think what you're talking about, that let go, that release, is such an important thing. And it also requires capacity, right? To have the capacity to stand in alignment with myself and not try to control to maintain the attachment, to not have the harsh inner critic, to regulate and modulate through that response. And for a long time in my life, and I would dive into so much personal development. I would work with my therapist and I would understand these concepts. Like I had this therapist that used to always tell me like, the truth is the truth, like capital T truth. So it doesn't matter, just go into the truth, go in for the highest, greatest good of both people in the relationship, speak the truth. And then whatever outcome comes is going to be the right outcome because it's in alignment with the truth. And we would go over this and I got it conceptually and I trusted something greater than myself. And I was in a really dysregulated state. And so I would prepare. This was specifically in context with an old business partner where the business was really out of alignment and it was kind of a mentorship role and business partnership. And so I had a lot of attachment to this person. And I would go in and I would write out what I was going to say and I would prepare and I would have these higher visions. And then every single time I would sit down and I would open my mouth to say something and nothing would come out, and or something completely different, and I would leave the conversation with so much shame that I couldn't do this, that I couldn't step into the truth. And what I didn't know then was that I still had all of these patterns running through my nervous system, and I did not have the capacity. And then what happened was I ended up building an unsustainable foundation for that partnership where I worked myself into the ground. I lost a lot of money, and these patterns that we have with boundaries play out everywhere in our life. And that's because from a neurosomatic perspective, boundary capacity is directly linked to regulation and sensory clarity and emotional processing. And when the nervous system is dysregulated, the brain prioritizes threat detection over self-awareness, which makes it difficult to sense our needs, our limits. And that's why when a boundary is set in a high arousal state, it comes out as abrupt or inconsistent or maybe not at all, right? So that was the really important piece for me, was building nervous system capacity through resourcing my nervous system, through sensory integration, improved interoceptive accuracy that would allow the boundaries to arise from clear internal data. And it helped me then move into new patterns, because what would also happen is I would go back to that therapist and eventually I just started lying to them.
Mhm.
I just started saying, yeah, I had the conversation. Yeah, I did the thing. And I just didn't know then what I know now about how to really work with that pattern and where it comes from.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's relatable for a lot of people. And for me, I was living in a way, just consistently in relationship where I was like really giving myself away. I was showing up as whoever you needed me to be in that moment. And it felt like for me internally was this real struggle of like feeling caged inside, where I was showing up like so inauthentically, and it was really painful to live that way. And so when I started learning about boundaries, it was really about trusting myself, like we've been talking about a little bit in this conversation already, and like not living from these protective reflexes, but making conscious choices little by little, and testing that out in relationships where I really trusted the person and trusted that my connection wouldn't get lost or severed. And I would feel not only anger like outwardly, but I was feeling so much anger inwardly. The inner
Mm,
critic was so loud, and it was really making me sick. Like
sick.
sick, cancer sick. And so learning almost where my boundaries of my literal body were, because also identifying as like a highly sensitive person and what I used to think as an empath, my volume dials were really dysregulated and turned up to a way that it wasn't livable.
Mhm.
It wasn't sustainable to feel everything else from everybody and then not to feel myself. And so working with my nervous system allowed for me to turn those volume dials down and learn my own sensations and my own emotions and what was really important to me, and learn more about like who I was. Instead of being organized around survival, it really was about um resourcing from safety and authenticity. Like we talk about minimum effective dose, it wasn't as dangerous anymore when I could titrate it and make it um almost like doable in practice.
Yeah.
And so I think as capacity increase, or what I know is that as capacity increases, the nervous system no longer defaults to these extremes that we've learned about. And boundaries can be expressed with steadiness and attunement because they come from presence and not urgency. And that shift is really foundational for post-traumatic growth. And so, Margy, I would love for you to talk about what it's like to learn how to receive boundaries. And maybe you can share a story that comes to mind for you that really shaped you there, and also the difference between setting boundaries from anger and from a neutral aligned place, because those are really different experiences.
Yes, they're very different experiences, and it can be easier to set a boundary from anger because it's such a good motivator. And I actually find it's harder to set a boundary when there's no anger because there's almost no momentum behind it. So you really just have to say it. And there's more of a fear, too, I think, relationally, of rocking the boat because when things are overall pretty good, it's like, am I crazy to say this when I know it's gonna, cause chaos? Well, I believe it will, maybe it won't, but when things are pretty smooth right now in this relationship. And so that I think is challenging, and it takes this work to be able to do that. And I think those really are the most powerful when it's not from a place of pushing back, when you're in a place of acceptance and maybe in a place of relative harmony, and you're like, you know what? Actually, right? This is what's true for me right now. And it is uncomfortable in a different way because, again, it's not that big push. It's like you're just sitting in the discomfort of it and you can't escape it. You can't escape it with a big emotional, you know what I mean? But there's something so powerful about doing that and then realizing that you're okay and using your tools to regulate around it. And I think sometimes when we set a boundary or say something from a place of anger, even if it's true and valid, it loses some of its impact as well with the person receiving it, right? I think sometimes we can discredit ourselves even when it's a very valid thing because there's so much outburst behind it. It's hard for people to really be present and listening because their nervous system is reacting to this push that they're
Mhm.
getting from us.
Mhm.
And so I think in this conversation about connection, it's so important. I had a mentor who said the highest frequency is the frequency of truth. And I think that's what we're talking about, right? Telling the truth, speaking our truth, being able to hold other people's truths and receive it in a way that's safe for them, that they know you're not going to react. And that, I mean, what could be more connecting than that? Because when you have connection, but it's not based on the truth, it's not real connection, right?
Mhm.
It's a approximation of connection, but it's not like the real thing. So I really think this is the only path to true connection. And then with receiving boundaries, I could tell a lot of stories because I've been on the receiving end of boundaries many times in business, right? Sometimes you will sign a contract with someone and you will realize halfway through that contract that you don't want to do this anymore, right? I've had that experience. I know other people have. You're working with a coach or someone and you're like, this isn't for me, but you made this commitment, you signed this contract. And so you have to be in integrity and like continue on with it. And it doesn't feel great. It doesn't always feel great. And being able to process the emotion of that. The other, okay, this is going to sound like the silliest, smallest thing, but this is the area where when this happens, I'm like, nailed it. So, like many people who've experienced trauma and a lot of nervous system dysregulation, I experienced a lot of dysregulation around food. And so when it comes to receiving boundaries, there's way bigger boundaries that I could talk about, but this is a little one that happens all the time that always makes me feel like, wow, I've like really changed. When I would ask like my wife if she's eating something and I'm hungry and it looks so good and I just want like one bite and I'm like, "Can I have a bite of that?" And she says, "No." And I'm like, "Okay." And every time I'm like, "Good for you, girl." Like because there's so much emotion behind hearing no, and especially hearing a no when you really want something, and when you have a nervous system that's sensitive around food and, like, food deprivation
Mhm.
and stuff like that. So, I know it's a silly example, but that is one where I'm like, "Wow, this stuff really works." Like, I feel so different inside, and I can just take this and be like, "Okay."
I think it's a
That's
great
huge.
example,
Yeah, it's
actually.
a great example.
And something that's coming up too that I want to say is like you talked about the idea of like rocking the boat and like relationships have unspoken patterns in them.
Mhm.
And when one person starts to show up differently, the other person doesn't really know how to respond because it's breaking the pattern, right? So relationships can often get frayed.
Mhm.
Right? It's not that they're beyond repair because I've experienced like a lot of repair within the friendship, but it also takes the consistency of the person who's setting the boundaries to stay in the pattern so that the other person in the relationship that you're in knows how to receive you now.
Yeah. And you have to have it time too for that rupture and repair. That's a
Yes.
huge part of establishing secure attachment is being in relationships where you can have the rupture and repair. And Margie, I think is a great example of the food because food can be really charged, right? Food equals love, food equals nurture. And like, what is that saying with that boundary and being able to neutralize that and have a different response inside to that reaction to honor the boundary is actually a really huge example. And before we go on to talk about like what we really mean when we say boundaries and what we're talking about, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more, Margie, too, because right now, like we're in a moment in your life where there is real time boundary work that's happening on a pretty big level. I know you have recently left the other business that you were a partner in, and I've been so amazed. And like it's such a testament to the work to witness how you guys are going about it because like you said, it was maybe a situation where it wasn't coming from anger, but there was a truth for you. And being able to navigate that and have those really difficult conversations, have a relationship where you have rupture and repair to come into an aligned agreement and make some big changes and still keep the relationship intact. And it's kind of the opposite of the experience I was talking about with my past business partnership, where I just couldn't ever get to that level of authentic expression to have the relationship be in alignment.
Yes. This was huge. This was just a few months ago, and it was something that internally and kind of externally with some people, there were conversations about this knowing that I wanted to move on. I wanted to be focusing on nervous system transformation full time. Really felt that internal calling that like I want to be contributing to the planet and to people in this way. And so I had a multi seven figure company that I co owned with someone who's a very good friend who's been on this podcast, Jess. And there was many reasons why it was very hard. It felt actually impossible. Like for a while I wanted to leave and I was like, well, there's nothing I can do. Like there's no way I can leave. And finally woke up one day and was like, I got to go. It's time. And I think there's really 3 parts to the boundary work we're talking about, which is really speaking your authentic truth. One is having the level of regulation to even see that, because if I did not have the nervous system capacity, I truly believe my subconscious would never have let me see that I needed to leave. It would have been way too threatening. I would have just been like, nope, like I'm just a little stressed or this, but it'll pass. Like this is how it is. Business is challenging. You know what I mean? And so to see I need to go. Then to be able to speak that truth. And then part 3, I think, is hold that truth,
Hmm.
not backtrack. Right. So this
Yeah,
is like
like
the
what you're saying.
3-part journey, right? I can see the truth within myself. I can now say the truth to the person who needs to hear it and make it real. And then I can hold the truth because there is going to be a period where the holding is very uncomfortable, where everybody's reacting to your decision. And I had the people closest to me were like, that's great. We're so happy for you. Because they kind of knew that I wanted to do something different. But a lot of people were like, "What? This is like a multi seven figure company. This is like a very cushy gig. You've been here almost a decade. Like, why would you just walk away from that?" And it was hard, right? Because we're talking about self trust. And I think no matter how much confidence and self trust you have, it's hard, especially in the middle of the night, not to think about the things very smart people are saying to you about, like, what are you thinking? And be like, is this crazy? Like, is this really can I trust myself enough to make a move this big based on I'm not gonna say a whim because it's not a whim, but based on this internal feeling, which is kind of abstract, right? That internal call is not something solid you can hold on to. There is something kind of ephemeral about it. And so to make big, solid, real life decisions based on that is intense and it takes a lot of trust.
It's like once you know the truth, you can't turn away from it. it may be ephemeral, but it is strong in your body. And when you've maybe been someone in your life who's turned away from your truth, given yourself away, and now you feel it, you can't. You're just lying to yourself. And you can't, we know what it's like to live that way. And it's like part of this work and being in your truth is like, I'm not going to lie to myself anymore. I'm not going to lie to other people. And like you're saying, it's like I'm saying this and I'm doing this, and there could be fallout. There could be consequences, and this is my truth.
Yeah, it's that real life example of the let go.
Mhm.
And then staying, like you were saying, you shift, the relationship changes, then the pattern changes, and then you have to stay
Yeah.
in the new thing. And that is what we're talking about requiring the capacity for that and having the practice of emotional processing through it. And it was really like, for me, like, okay, Margy's living the work right now, and I could witness it in real time because there's no way that unfolds in the way that it did without knowing that you're also living the work.
But also, too, Jess is living the work,
Mhm.
right? She shows up and she
Mhm.
does this work. So that also lends itself to trust in your relationship. Like, okay, I'm doing the work, they're doing the work. So we can have a more honest conversation here where hopefully this nervous system can receive
Mhm.
this boundary without the collapse
Mhm.
of the relationship.
Yeah.
Yes. The more people in your life who are using the Rewire membership regularly, the easier these conversations go, right? Yeah. And it was like, I had to see the truth and then speak the truth. And we talked about like it not coming from a place of anger. Jess and I's relationship was probably like the best it had ever been. We have great relationship. And so it was relationally scary. It was financially very scary. I mean, there was a lot of uncertainty. But yes, just doing this work, just using the Rewire membership every single day, we send each other videos back and forth of like, oh, I just did this one. It's so good. But that was huge because I was able to speak the truth and she was able to receive it. And
Mhm.
as hard as it was to speak it, I'm sure it was equally hard to hear it. And also, I'd had, you know, I did it pretty fast, but I'd had a few hours to like think this over of this is what I'm going to do. She had no preparation. She was having a normal morning and then suddenly I'm like, here's what's going on. And so yeah, that could have gone very badly, but it went really well and it was hard and we were able to process our stress and use the neurosomatics and process our emotions and go through this uncoupling, this separating things out, coming up with the exit and the deal and everything like that in a way that did come from love and respect. It was not we kept joking that it was like a divorce where you have a conscious uncoupling, right? It was not contentious. We were able to really be like, okay, I want you to be good. I want me to be good. Like, let's talk about how this looks that works for both of us. And we're able to end a business partnership in a business that is not small within a couple of months. I mean, I know people who spent years dissolving a partnership and literally it was early November and by January 1st of this year I was out. I'm no longer an owner. So we were able it happened so fast and I think when you are aligned with the truth, things start to unfold very very fast.
Mhm.
Mhm. I think this is an example of also too how when we talk about boundaries, what we're talking about is much more expansive than just this hard wall or like a rigid ultimatum. It is this way of really coming into relationships, businesses, our life with like the highest, greatest good in mind and standing in that and opening up so much more from that. And so I really want us to dive into a little bit about what we actually mean when we're talking about boundaries. And we just had a conversation recently with Raquel, the capacity expert. And when we were talking, she named her resistance to even using the word boundary like you just did, Margy, because of how often boundaries are framed as defensive or relational severing. And here we can see this example of how it expanded the relationship to be more in alignment with the truth. And I think boundaries do have kind of a bad reputation in some ways because They're frequently taught from a place of protection or anger or control rather than from that regulated place of presence. And so, what we are talking about here, what we mean with boundaries is really like a coming home to ourself, an internal alignment where behavior and communication and action reflect what our nervous system can genuinely be present with and support in that moment. And so, from a nervous system perspective, boundaries are signals of internal coherence. When sensory input and interception and regulation are clear, our boundaries can arise without force. Aligned boundaries can start to communicate capacity rather than rejection. And that deeper connection is then what helps improve nervous system health. And I do want to talk about something specifically here when we're talking about boundaries and them having a bad reputation. I think it is also important to understand that it is a skill that's important for people to develop, especially if you are an individual who experienced early body boundary violations. Learning boundaries is also a form of biological repair, right? It starts to restore agency. It recalibrates threat detection. It supports long-term nervous system health. This is a real lived experience for me because my inability to set boundaries was keeping me in a chronic stress state. And my body was starting to hold and set the boundaries that I couldn't set out in the world. And that was below the level of my consciousness. It was reflexive, it was inflammation and bracing and pelvic floor tension. And so it is important that we understand that this is something that people sometimes really do need support with, not just for relationships, but for health and for the way that our body is, the load that our body is carrying.
I 100% think that my lack of boundaries and my anger around boundaries is related to those early body boundary violations and like that chronic stress and constant nervous system activation. My boundaries did show up as abrupt cutoffs, public call outs, rigid lines, and like they came from reactivity versus regulation. And when boundaries are set from anger, fear, or overwhelm, they do feel punishing and dismissive, and that reinforces the idea that boundaries are inherently divisive rather than stabilizing. And what we're really talking about here is boundaries being pointing to self-connection and nervous system alignment. But for people whose nervous systems learn to leave the body or override the internal signals to feel safe, boundaries became a way back into embodiment and helping us rebuild trust in our sensations, restore relational safety, and allow connection without collapse over accommodation and withdrawal. And so let's explore a little bit deeper, Margery, like why boundaries have developed such a negative reputation in our current social climate, and how is it different from what we're talking about here? And like, why do you see aligned boundaries as essential for reducing reactivity and supporting post-traumatic growth, both individually and collectively?
So I think, first of all, the idea that people just inherently know how to set and receive boundaries well is just not the case. And like what you're talking about, body violations, certain types of trauma certainly makes it harder. But I would argue that the average person is not great at boundaries, whether it's setting or receiving. It's very normalized in our culture. If somebody says no to you, to even if on the surface you're like, okay, sounds good, like you're going to call your best friend and be like, can you believe what this person said to me? And like they had the nerve. And like that is not receiving a boundary well, right? There's a lot of ego and internal resistance. So I think there's many reasons that boundaries have been changed and have a bad rap. The word itself is not great. I think it stems from the very beginning that they probably weren't well understood, if that's the word that was used. I also think that with social media, everything is very oversimplified. There's a lot of ego. So it's a lot of just like cut people off and say no. And like all that matters is your comfort and your happiness. And it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. And that's not really what we're going for here. And so I think that's a lot of it. I would also argue, and what you said, Jennifer, I think is very important. most of our experience with boundaries is with people who are not great at setting and receiving boundaries. And so not only do we probably have our own issues with setting and receiving boundaries, but the boundaries we have received have probably been from people who aren't very good at setting boundaries because most people aren't. And so that definitely gives it a negative connotation, right? Because if you're like, well, I want to be someone who's good at receiving boundaries, right? I don't want to be toxic. But the people who set boundaries with me, they were yelling at me, you know what I mean? And so I think that that all comes together to give it kind of an icky vibe. And I think the goal with neurosomatic boundary work is to really change that, to change people's understanding cognitively, and more importantly, their felt experience of setting and receiving boundaries. And it's really about being able to live authentically, which is so powerful, and being able to be a boundary leader. Because when you are excellent at setting and receiving boundaries, other people get better at it. And
Mhm.
other people start feeling safe with you, right? If people know that I'm going to tell them the truth compassionately and that I can receive their truth, and they have a couple reps of telling me something and me receiving it in a safe way, they're going to start to get better, even if it's just in our relationship.
Mhm.
And so I really think this is something that we can collectively transform by more of us taking on this work personally to be boundary leaders to create more authenticity and connection.
I think that that is really important to understand the collective misunderstanding, perhaps, of boundaries as something different from self-expression with non-attachment to the outcomes. And I do think the reactions in the body are there's a spectrum, right? And there's no doubt that our past experiences shape the intensity of the stress responses that occur around boundaries and boundary violations and having to set boundaries depending on our developmental experiences. And so I think it's important that we also touch on attachment when we're thinking about boundary, because we want to definitely remember that boundary setting is not a personality issue, right? And if it is, it's a very broad personality issue, but they are attachment adaptations, and it's shaped by whether connection felt safe and attuned and regulating in the body. And when we look at these patterns of inability to express boundaries, especially like avoidance or people pleasing, collapse, and then also to the reactivity, the aggression, the hyperindependence, and the hypervigilance. All of these things are intelligent nervous system strategies to preserve attachment when attunement was inconsistent or unsafe. There is a reason that our system learned these things. And so repatterning attachment is not just about the insight alone. It requires the safety and the repetition and the sensory clarity so that the nervous system can learn something new. And I want to make sure that we mention that attachment styles can't be so easily categorized into like, I'm anxious, I'm avoidant, I'm disorganized. That attachment styles aren't fixed traits, they're dynamic and they're context dependent neurotags that shift based on relational safety, nervous system regulation, present moment experiences, meaning that the same person can experience different attachment strategies across relationships over time as the nervous system updates its predictions and depending on the relationships that we're in, right? And so the attachment patterns that play out at that really physiological influencing, like the physiological that then influences the cognitive, is not coming from words or beliefs or even conscious memory a lot of the time. It's shaped through attunement that begins in utero and it continues through early caregiving. And before birth, even, the developing nervous system is regulated through the caregiver's nervous system, with early vagus nerve development influenced by the quality of regulation, stress, relational safety that's present in the body of the caregiver. And because our earliest senses are movement and touch, attachment strategies and patterns are encoded somatically. And that's why attachment patterns show up automatically in boundaries, in conflict, in connection, long before our cognition can come online. So to set boundaries that are aligned, one of the most important things is repatterning attachment at that somatic level. And secure attachment is a physiological state that's built through repeated experiences of embodied presence, of attunement, of mirroring, of consistency, and of that rupture followed by repair. So having my practices to do, giving my nervous system capacity, developing safe relationship, and then like having relationships now, like the relationship that I have with both of you, where we can have a rupture and we can stay present and embody it as it's happening, and then we can repair, right? You can tell me the truth about things, Margie, like you were talking about, and I can have that experience of you receiving my truth and me being able to receive yours, and we can repattern that with our practices and with by being in community with people who also have those practices, so that our nervous system, that is how we start to repattern our attachment.
Yeah. I mean, it makes so much sense, really, when you think about like development in utero and like touch and sensation and co-regulation. I mean, it just makes so much sense why and how we would never learn about boundaries coupled with body boundary violations, the spectrum that means, and living with them through society
Yeah.
and growing up in the misunderstanding
hmm
of boundaries.
That's the developmental water that we're all swimming in
Exactly,
collectively.
exactly. And somatic attachment work focuses on building secure attachment through embodied attunement rather than the cognitive insight, which so many of us have been living in for all this time. Practices like mirroring allow the nervous system to experience being seen and reflected at a sensory level, where one person might lead with simple movement, gesture, or vocalization, and the other mirrors it accurately, not to perform, but to attune. Maybe you do call and response. If you're someone who experiences an insecure attachment, like maybe an anxious or disorganized attachment, we want to work in practices that emphasize staying in our own bodies while also orienting to others at the same time. And we do that with supportive touch or objects to increase oxytocin, training the nervous system to remain embodied in connection. So if you're feeling sensations of avoidance and escape, titration with sensation allows permission to move in and out of feeling, learning that sensation and intimacy can be tolerated without overwhelm. Across all patterns, the nervous system learns safety through slow embodied presence and not force. And when we're working with attachment, it's a process because you may identify with having all of the attachment styles. I
hmm
do.
Me
You
too.
know, I can show up secure over here and maybe anxious over here or disorganized over here. So it's learning how to embrace security a little by little. And I think that comes with the self-trust that we've been talking about so much.
Yeah. Margie, you want to share a little bit about how self-attunement has changed the way you relate to boundaries? And we've talked about this a lot with like the neurosomatic resets, not just being emotional processing, but being this practice of self-attunement and how that starts to like weave out into leadership, into business, when we have this ability to gradually and gently attune to ourselves.
Yes. This is one of those things that I can't believe how big an impact it has, because when you're doing it, it feels like nothing. Like, it feels like such a small thing. And I feel like when I thought about emotional processing, I thought about those big ones, like where you're like screaming and like, and those definitely have a place. But when I started forcing myself to do the consistent neurosomatic resets and really found, oh, these are really more like attunement, right? Because I'm not like, there's not this big release. It's very, very subtle. And I'm looking internally. I'm feeling those, interoceptive sensations in my body. And I'm watching my emotions. I'm seeing how I feel. And it seems like such a minor thing, and I worked it in once a week, which is what we recommend. It's really, really important, and it really started to compound for me, and then I realized I felt so different. First of all, I was like, "Wow, there's a lot of emotions in just one day." Even in 1 hour, and it's not like getting carried away. It's not like I was, like, sobbing, crying, and then, like, manically laughing, but it's like I could feel them passing through, and First of all, I feel like it really helped me better understand emotions and feelings. I think that even in the way we speak about them, it shows such a misunderstanding, like the saying things like, I want to be happy, when it's like, well, an emotion is like a fleeting thing. You can't like be that. You can't like nail that down. And so it helped me really see them move through, and it gave me such a different relationship with negative emotion. And I do think it helped with boundaries and connection even more because I was able to feel frustration with my partner or to feel a slight upset because I wanted to eat that food and they said no, I couldn't have any. And then like let it go. Like things weren't getting stuck the way they had been before. And I think also we've talked so much about attachment. I really feel like it's like the most profound reparenting thing I've ever done in my entire life. Because being a parent is really hard, regardless of like the type of parent that you had, even if you had a like best case scenario, your parent probably can't attune to every single emotion that you have and also like have a job and like function and deal with their own emotions. And so I think especially for those of us who have disorganized attachment or are attachment maximalists, which I definitely relate to. I feel like I've got a little bit of everything. I think it is so profound to attune to our own emotions internally. And I've really felt so much security and self trust come from that. And I think that I'm better able to now be present with other people's emotions and just let them happen and not feel like I need to fix things or get away from them, which is so profound as a parent of a toddler. Like, I think it's going to benefit her so much too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is such a foundation of boundaries and that repatterning our ability to attune to ourselves, to be able to express emotions, and then really just presence, right? But being able to be present with whatever we're feeling, with other people's feelings. And when we are setting boundaries without presence, they're almost always reactive on some end of the spectrum. We're either shutting down or we're overreacting. And our nervous system is replaying these patterns from the past rather than being in that present moment. And when we can create capacity in our nervous system for presence, that is what allows boundaries to emerge from that internal place of alignment and sensing what's happening in the moment rather than prediction based on the past experience. So we can have the capacity to feel and to act in alignment with those sensations. And that allows our boundaries to be clearer and kinder and more neutralized and maybe firm, but not with so much force. And when we're talking about presence, always remembering that that's not just a mindset or a belief state, it is a reflection of our nervous system's capacity.
I'll just speak to a practice that I have that really helped me with boundaries and using my voice was that, I didn't know how to say no. And that I had to practice that. And the way that I practice that is I really love laying on the floor and being supported by the floor, although I have done this practice in my bed. But I will do some NSI, I'll do some neuro, usually it's sensory stimulus, sometimes at the same time while I'm just saying the word no over and over and over, where I might scream it or whisper it, or, I'm saying it while I'm crying. And I might set a timer for maybe like 10 or 15 minutes. And it is literally the only word that will come out of my mouth.
Mm.
And it's really helped me. It's helped parts of me that never got to say no learn how to say no or have the opportunity to express that in a really safe body, in a safe highest self, and in a safe environment. And then it also supports a future me that is going to need to say no, even if it's something that, you know, I don't have the fuel space for, and like the discernment of when to say yes and when to say no. And so I just want to share that as a practice that's supported me and many of my clients.
I think it's a beautiful practice. And I will say, I think these practices, like what you're talking about, the repetitions for the nervous system of saying no in a safe body and building on those over time, the self-attunement that Margy was talking about. And then in addition to that, what's been really helpful for me is working with my vocals and doing vocal processing with my neuro before and after big conversations to help move my diaphragm, my vocals to come out of these patterns of chronic bracing. And then I'm going into that experience, into that conversation differently. And then I'm processing afterwards. And I'm not dissociating, shutting down, checking out, either before, during, or after. And I do want to say, too, this isn't a topic that we're all really passionate about here. It's been a huge part of all of our healing experience. And Margy and I did create a course for this where we're starting to introduce people into these practices that we're talking about and neurosomatic tools and building the capacity, receiving boundaries, all of the things that we've talked about today. So if you go to boundaryrewired.com, you can have access to it. It's a great entry point to bring the nervous system into this so that boundaries are moving beyond that cognitive level. Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Margy. We love having you here. And thank you both for this conversation. And thank you so much for listening. If this episode resonated, share it with someone. And don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss any of the conversations coming. The topic of boundaries is deeply personal to me. For much of my life, I lived in patterns of fawn and freeze, silencing myself, avoiding conflict, overgiving. I tried every mindset and communication tool, but nothing changed until I understood my nervous system. My body was wired to prioritize connection at all costs, and the physical toll was really big for me. We now know that chronic people-pleasing and emotional suppression is linked to inflammation, unwanted health outcomes, burnout, and that was me. Learning to set and receive boundaries wasn't just a relational skill. It was physical and emotional healing and repatterning. And that's why we created Boundary Rewire. It's a deep and practical guide into neurosomatic repatterning to help you find safety and self-expression. You can get it for $27 at boundaryrewire.com. This is some of the most transformational work I've done in my own journey, distilled into a foundational course because I believe that we should all have access to these practices. So again, join us at boundaryrewire.com and you can get in on this for $27.